The Start to Finish Reloading series is brought to you by epintegrations, home of the EP 2.0 brass annealer. They can anneal from 300 blackout to 50 BMG and everything in between without having to add or remove any parts, and can adjust in less than 30 seconds from cartridge to cartridge. Also, the home of the epintegrations lockdown reloading block, the last reloading tray you will ever need. And it's fully adjustable, just under 223 and just over 375 shy tack, and it can adjust in less than 1 second. For further information, check out the description box below for www.epintegrations.com. Enough said, let's get this going. Well, welcome back to part 5 of this epintegrations start to finish reloading series. We're finally up to the point of dropping powder and seating that bullet. And before we fill out this index information card, we need to figure out which bullet we are going to use and the corresponding powder with that bullet. It's really important to make sure that you are referencing those bullet manufacturers' guides in regards to how much powder you should drop for that particular bullet. Now, in the previous part of the series, in part 4, we used the CCI 400 small rifle primer. So we got that out of the way. But there's a few other things I need to go over with you in regards to bullet seating depth, trying to figure out bullet jump. I'm about to go over that in a little bit. And also some other minute things. But let's just jump right into this in regards to the bullet and the powder that we are going to use in this series. Now, I am reloading the 60 grain VMAX Hornady flat base bullet. Probably one of the most accurate bullets in my opinion, especially for the money. You can usually get 100 of these for $19.99 at my local Shields. And it's a flat base bullet, you know, in comparison to something like this 73 grain ELD match that has somewhat of a boat tail on the back. You know, the heavier the bullet, the further distance it can fly. And they'll put a boat tail on the back here to help increase the bullet coefficient of this bullet. And, you know, something heavy like that with a 223 or 5.56 would be great if you're shooting extreme long distance of 600 yards or more. I have shot this 60 grain flat base bullet at 600 yards or less, and it's deadly accurate. Believe it or not, the 60 grain VMAX can print, no joke, sub MOA groups at 600 yards. Just because it's a flat base bullet doesn't mean it's not going to be accurate. It's extremely accurate. No matter what I put it in, it performs. But in order to figure out how much powder we need to drop, that's where you need to reference your bullet manufacturer's manuals or guides. And in this section of 223, you can see it's got the general overview of the cartridge. See if I can zoom in here. We already went over the case trim length, but they're just kind of going over the general information of 223. And usually these bullets are sectioned out in grain weight. So 40 grains, 45, 50, 52 to 53, 55 grain bullets. And obviously we are doing 60 grain VMAX. Now, I particularly like to use Varget powder when it comes to 223 and 308 casings. And in this situation with a 60 grain VMAX, I'm using Varget here. And you can see they're giving you suggestions here in regards to the amount of powder you should drop. Personally, with my pet load, I like to use this 23.8 grains of Varget, which corresponds to roughly 2,900 feet per second. Now, this is just a guide. It's not totally accurate. To know the true FPS or feet per second, you need to use a chronograph and develop that load. But you can use this as a rule of thumb, especially if you don't have a chronograph, of how much powder you should drop. And you can see, at least with this Varget, it's starting to redline at 24.9. You should not exceed that number without doing careful load development, especially using a chronograph and looking for signs of overpressure, such as cratered primers, ejector swipes, blah, blah, blah. But in this situation, we are dropping 23.8 grains of Varget, also known as unobtainium or Varget. And at least right now in December of 2021, the really any powder to that fact is impossible to get, but especially the top two, in my opinion, for 223 and 308, my go-to is Varget, very temp stable powder. You know, when I say temp stable, if you develop a load, say in the middle of summer, it's hot and humid, and it works great during the summer, and then winter rolls around, it's damn near 0 degrees out, that same load might not perform if you pick a powder that's not temp stable. And Varget's definitely one of those powders that is definitely temp stable. On at least for my 6mm and 6.5mm bullets, such as 6 Creedmoor, 243, 6.5 Creedmoor, I'm usually using H4350. Those are usually my two go-to powders, and that's why they're very popular and they're very hard to get, especially right now. But just to kind of give you a quick overview, make sure you are referencing your bullet manufacturer's powder drop rates. If you're using Sierra bullet, make sure you're referring to their powder drop rates, especially if you're new and you're trying to get an idea of how much powder you should drop. And while I'm here on this page, I might as well go over cartridge overall length. And you can see it has COL. It's an acronym, cartridge overall length. It's just a suggestion from the bullet manufacturer of how deep you should seat that bullet over the actual cartridge overall length, the distance from the base of the brass to the very tip of the bullet. Once you seat that bullet, they're recommending 2.250 inches. You know, a lot of guys, especially for semi-automatics, when you're dealing with a magazine, they'll try to extend out that length to maximum magazine length, or use other tools in regards to bullet comparators of how far you can seat out that bullet in relationship to the maximum extended length of seating that bullet until the bullet's ogive or secant radius comes in contact with the rifling's lands. And I'm about to go over that here in a little bit, so it's not too confusing. But you can always reference your bullet manufacturer's guides here of how deep to seat that bullet or the overall length of that cartridge. And in this case, it's 2.250. So keep that in the back of your mind. So now we got everything figured out. 60 grain VMAX bullet, Varget powder. We're using Lake City brass with the CCI 400 primer. Now is a good time to fill out our information card. So I have 100 pieces, today's date, and this is for my 20-inch Varmint Rock River Arms rifle. And right out of the gate, I usually start out with the brass. This is 5.56 Lake City 05 brass, and you can always tell what year that this brass was made. There's usually a stamp on then here. Matter of fact, I'll splice it a picture. It's a little more clear. And just to show you on this, at least on this Lake City, this shows Lake City. It has a NATO symbol on it right there, and an 05 year. And I actually like to put that 05 year on my information card. Reason why is if I eject this and it goes onto the ground, mixes in with a bunch of other brass, I can always reference that that was 05 year Lake City brass, and I know that that brass was ejected out of my firearm. So if I'm hunting that down, that definitely helps. Next part is the bullet we're using. So 60 grain VMAX Hornady, and we are dropping 23 8-point grains of Varget. Some other useful information you might want to put in here is obviously the primers. So CCI 400 primer, and some other things such as what does this particular firearm fire form at? And we know it fire forms, at least I know, fire forms at 3/1000 of an inch above this number of 1.454. And we did a bumped headspace of 1.451, and you guys witnessed that. Also, something else you can put on here is your cartridge overall length is 2.250, and I'm actually not going to fill that out right yet. I'm actually going to try and load this close to cartridge maximum magazine cartridge overall length. It's going to be close to that 2.250, but we'll get back to this once we see those bullets. Otherwise, that's pretty much the general information you should put on your information card. You start doing load development and you start dropping at different powder drop rates and using a selection of different bullets. That's something you might be able to put down here at the bottom, but that's just a general idea of filling out your information card. So while we're on the subject of coal cartridge overall length, like I said, we're probably going to get close to maximum magazine length. I'm going to show that here in a little bit, but there are tools out there that you can use that will help you figure out what is the maximum bullet seating depth until that bullet comes in contact with the rifling's lands. And in this diagram, you can kind of see this is the chamber of your barrel. At the end here is your case mouth opening of the casing itself. So just to kind of show you here of what this looks like, it'd be right about there. And that's where the bullet sticks out. And you can extend out your bullet out of the casing up to the point where the secant radius of the bullet comes in contact with the rifling's lands. This is literally a ramp that accepts the bullet and allows that bullet to travel down the rifle's bore. And there's also what's known as a throat or free bore, and that's literally where the bullet literally flies through the air as it exits the brass casing, and the secant radius or the ogive of the bullet comes in contact with that rifling's lands and starts this journey down the rifle's bore. And you can use tools like this in regards to trying to figure out how far you can extend that bullet up to the point where the bullet comes in contact with the rifling's lands. As a matter of fact, I will grab one of these 60 grain VMAX, and this is what's called a modified case, and it has a special tapped end to this brass 223 casing. And this casing is set up to my firearms fireform chamber with a 3/1000 of an inch bump back on it, like I expressed earlier in this part of the series. And you can actually insert your bullet flavor of choice. And you can see I can push on this rod and it will extend that bullet out of that modified case. And what I can do with this tool here is I can insert this modified case into my rifle's chamber, and I can press or push on this rod up to the point where the bullet pushes out, and the secant or ogive of the bullet comes in contact with the rifling's lands. And then I can lock this down, and that is my maximum bullet seating depth that is allowed in my particular rifle's chamber. And you can use these tools to help figure this out. I'm not going to go into full depth on this. If I did, this would be a whole other half-hour part of the series. This kind of somewhat is expert reloading techniques, especially when you're trying to figure out bullet jump. And when I say bullet jump, when that powder ignites and pushes that bullet out of the casing, your bullet literally flies a very minute amount through the air if the bullet's already not in contact with the rifling's lands. And we're talking thousandths of an inch. And more times than not, I like to start out with a 20,000th of an inch jump, usually with my reloads if I have the ability to do so. And that bullet will literally fly through the air a very minute amount. We're talking 20,000ths of an inch until the bullet's ogive or secant radius comes in contact with the rifling's lands, and it starts this journey down the rifle's bore. Like I said, I'm not going to go into full detail on this in regards to using bullet comparators and figuring out bullet jumps. That might be something to do above and beyond this series, but I just wanted to make you guys aware of it. And these bullet comparators actually use the same Hornady body as your headspace bushings here. You can actually remove the headspace bushing that you guys have seen in the early parts of this video series. So I can actually remove this. And there's bullet comparators that use the exact same body. Matter of fact, I have this noted with 223, and I can insert this. Let me get you guys zoomed in here. And I can tighten this down, and I can clamp this onto my calipers. And say, for pure example's sake, this is where my bullet was able to extend out of the casing and came in contact with my rifling's lands. I'll say, like, I'm pushing it out and pushing it out, pushing it out, pushing it out until this is the point where it cannot extend out any further. And I can actually lock this down, and I can take that measurement by clamping this entire unit onto my calipers, and I can take a measurement of that based off the bullet's ogive. You can see that this isn't measuring off the tip of the bullet. This is actually measuring off the bullet's ogive. Radius, secant radius of the bullet comes in contact with the rifling's lands. And this is actually the most accurate way of measuring bullet seating depth, believe it or not. Reason why, especially with boat tail hollow point bullets, the tips of these bullets are not exactly perfect. Even these super precise ballistic tips can be a little off. And trying to measure consistent bullet seating depths using the tip of your bullets is not always the best. If you want the most precise way of measuring bullet seating depth, it's using the bullet's ogive or secant radius of where the bullet's radius comes in contact with your rifling's lands. And that's why I want to show you this diagram. Matter of fact, I will splice in a picture of me bore scoping a bore to show you what the rifling's lands look like. Now here is the lands of that particular rifling, right from the crown or the muzzle. And that looks really good. Let me spin this over to the next one. So that looks really nice. Nice and consistent lands. You can see where this one starts and ends. So right there. So this one ends. Starts and ends right there. Where the lands accepts the bullet into the rifling itself. So very, very consistent. Wow, and this is what you get with a very high-end barrel. And just to check out start of the bore, and I'll see the chamber itself. So let's go all the way down. There's the cap, there's the body. This is where the neck starts, and that's your free bore right there. So man, oh man, does that ever look awesome. All right, so enough of the blabber talk. Let's move on to dropping powder here. Now, when it comes to powder dispensers, I recommend just biting the bullet. It's probably one of your top 3 major reloading component purchases. You know, above and beyond your reloading press, this is probably your next major purchase. And I mean, yeah, I suppose you could do it the old analog way, but when crying out loud, or past 2020 here, there's no reason why you shouldn't be using, at least in my opinion, some type of electronic powder dispenser. You know, some of these options through RCBS, especially if you're just starting out and you can barely afford it, something like this ChargeMaster, you know, light here, it's $290. You know, if you want to step up a little bit further, you can go up to the ChargeMaster Supreme, or definitely all the way up to the top end model here at $900, the Matchmaster, which is probably not totally needed, especially if you're just starting out. You know, if you want to buy once, cry once, that's definitely an option. You know, I use and started out with the old classic ChargeMaster here, and I use the FX120i. It's a literal lab scale with the V3 version 3 auto trickler powder dispenser and trickle unit. And you know, these are obviously some solid options here from RCBS, but with that being said, Auto Trickler came out with their new V4 above and beyond the V3 unit that I use, and I'm about to show that to you here in a little bit. What it does is the main powder drop, and then there's a trickle that trickles off the minute amount at the very end. And it looks like he went away with the main powder drop, and he's got a main larger auger and a smaller auger for trickling off the very tail end of the powder drop. And These are on pre-order right now. I think you can get this here really soon in the next month or so. Right now it's December 2021. But with that being said, Area 419 is also coming out what's called the Super Trickler, which I am really excited about. And at the very end of this page here, it looks like they're saying units are expected to be available early at 2022. So I don't know. I'm kind of up in the air whether or not I want to update my V3 to this Auto Trickler V4. But there's also this Super Trickler, which is $600. They're not exactly giving this away. So I don't know. It's definitely something to keep in mind, but I would just recommend getting some type of electronic powder dispenser. So a couple things here. First and foremost, make sure you're wearing your safety glasses. Obviously, we're dealing with black powder here. And I like to let my scales warm up for at least a good solid 10 minutes before I use them. It's really important to make sure you do that to make sure that they don't drift. And what can happen is some of these scales will drift over a period of time. And it's something to keep an eye out for, and I'm about to go over that here in a little bit. But let's get some vargit powder in my FX120i here with the V3 Auto Trickler powder drop and trickle unit. And get some powder into my trickler. Now, something I want to touch base with you guys on is environmentals and electrical interference with these lab scales. Regardless of the electronic scale that you're using, make sure you don't have things such as cell phones immediately right next to your lab scale. That can throw it off. Matter of fact, you can see I got a wind shroud around my FX120i here. Just me breathing, exhaling onto the lab scale could throw it off and make it drift. I even had to go as far as putting aluminum foil tape around the plenum of my furnace here because there was a crack allowing wind to blow out of this and onto my lab scale, making it drift. Even I had a little crack around here on my 6-inch pipe that was pushing air down onto my lab scale, throwing it off. You know, these newer LED lights here, they seem to be pretty good. Even you can see I have an LED TV right next to mine, and it doesn't really screw around with my lab scale much. But if you happen to have the older fluorescent lighting that has a ballast in it, that fluorescent lighting with ballast, they are the absolute bane to these electrics powder dispensers. To make sure you don't have those older fluorescent lighting in your loading room. All right, so let's drop some powder here. I'm going to enter 23.8 and tap the set target. So this should just automatically dump the main drop there with the powder drop. You can see it's trickling off there on the side. Trying to make sure I don't breathe on this thing because it's literally that sensitive. So this is going to drop within 0.02 grains of accuracy. So that's 23.82. Our target was 23.8. That's within 0.02. One little speck of vargit powder is no joke. Damn near 0.02 grains. So in theory, this is dropping within 1 to maybe 2 grains at the most of actual vargit powder. And that's how accurate this FX120i with the V3 combo unit is. And this was the best of the best pretty much here in the last few years with this setup. And you know, obviously everyone's kind of drifting away from this and they're moving on to the V4 unit now, which I might just do myself if I don't get that Super Trickler unit. Like I said, I'm kind of up in the air which one I want to get. And to be honest with you, I don't know if I really need them. I mean, this thing actually works quite amazing. You can see how fast it's dropping within 0.02 of 23.8. Literally 1 or 2 specks of actual vargit powder. So it's within 0.02. Now, just as a side note here in regards to drifting, as I pull this pan off, I'll notice it says 750.68. And as I put the pan back on, drops the next powder charge. I'll keep an eye on that 750.68. And if I notice it starts to drift off, it starts to saying 750.66, 750.64. I notice that it starts to drift. I am going to shut down this operation and re-zero this pan. And you can see it says 750.68, and I'm going to keep an eye on that to make sure it's not drifting. If it is drifting, that usually means you're getting some type of electronic interference of some sort, or maybe you have wind blowing on the scale, or me just breathing on it. You can see I'm trying to move my face away from the scale, so I'm not breathing on the scale. It's literally that sensitive. But once again, 750.68, and I'm going to keep an eye on that to make sure it's not drifting. All right, so we are getting down to the end here. One left to go, 100 total powder drops. And what I like to do at the very end here is I grab my little LED lamp and just double check all my powder drop levels to make sure that they all are consistent. And I'm definitely not missing a powder drop, and just one of these would be a bad day. And I'll clip you out of here. And what I'm doing is I'm just double checking, making sure every single row here has powder in it. Now, if you just miss one of these with no powder, you're going to get what's called a squib load. And what will happen is that one without any powder, you pull that trigger and that primer ignites with no powder. It's enough to push the bullet out of the casing and into the bore, and it will get stuck. And if that casing ejects and a fresh new cartridge is inserted into the chamber, and God forbid you pull that trigger, you are going to have a bad day, my friend. That barrel will explode. So it's really important to make sure that all your powder levels are consistent, and 100% that you're not missing powder in just one of those casings. Now, what I personally do with the EP lockdown reloading blocks, at least when I'm dropping powder, I like to make sure that these are completely locked home. These aren't wobbling, powder is spilling out of my casings. That's where these really shine. But when I'm done dropping powder, what I like to do is just feather these off ever so slightly and then re-lock these back down. And the reason why I like to do that, so I can easily pull these casings out as I seat those bullets. We are finally up to the point of seating bullets, and there is a hotly debated topic in regards to whether you should seat with a crimp or not, especially for a semi-automatic or an AR. Now, this is just my opinion, but I do not seat with a crimp. I might seat with a crimp if it's something like hunting ammunition. I might put a light kiss of a crimp on it, or especially something like, it's the fan type of ammunition that you're damn near going to bury into the ground. Yeah, I might put a crimp on it. But when it comes to my precision reloads, I do not seat with a crimp. As long as you have adequate neck tension on your brass, in my opinion, regardless if it's an AR, semi-automatic, or bolt action, you do not need a crimp. And then there's going to be someone in there in the comments making that comment about, oh my God, if you don't crimp, it's the end of the world. Like I said, in my opinion, as long as you have good neck tension, you do not need to seat with a crimp. But with that being said, just make sure that you're reading those dies, understanding how to set them up, obviously reading your directions on the particular press that you have. Each press is obviously different. With that said, we're pretty much to the end here. Matter of fact, I already seated a couple bullets here. And just to show you, and as a quick reminder, that the book recommends a cartridge overall length of 2.250. And at least for these three that I just seated, I got them at pretty much maximum magazine length. And when I say maximum magazine length, I got it so they just ever so slightly fit in the magazine. You got to leave a little bit of clearance. I got roughly about a 1/16 of an inch clearance with this P-mag. And that's something you definitely might want to do, is just make sure that they seat into your magazine properly. You know that they're going to get stripped off nice. Absolutely no issues. And just to show you where I have these seated, remember out of the book was 2.250, and this is 2.255. That's typically what I do with my pet loads. Let's measure this one here, 2.2555, and this one is 2.2560. So when you're measuring off the tips of the bullet, especially if they're just hollow points, that measurement is never going to be the same. You can drive yourself crazy, and definitely make sure you're not chasing your tail on that, especially when you're going off cartridge overall length, or from the base of the casing to the tip of the bullet. Make sure you're not completely adjusting your seating die up and down, trying to get the exact perfect seating depth. If you are measuring off the tip of the bullet, it will never happen. So once again, if you want, you can use a bullet comparator where this clamps on to your calipers and it measures off the bullet's ogive or the secant radius of where that bullet comes in contact with the rifle and lands in your rifle's bore. That actually is the best and most accurate way of doing it. But when it comes to at least semi-automatic AR ammunition like this, and it's not a bolt action, I'm not totally concerned about it. But if you are going for the utmost precision, you are reloading for a bolt action, you very well might want to do that. Measure off the bullet's ogive secant radius and not off the tip of the bullet. And as a last final note, I highly recommend using an anvil when possible. You know, if you do have cratered primers, and that's why I always recommend knocking out those primers as your first step in the reloading process. When I say cratered primers, say like you're getting over pressuring, and when that firing pin comes home on that primer, the primer will flow around the firing pin head and will crater. And that will literally stick out thousandths of an inch. And that thousandths of an inch, if you don't decap and deprime that casing, is one of the first steps in reloading process, and you leave that crater primer in there, when you go to make a measurement of something like, you know, whatever the length of your brass, or you're double checking headspace, either headspace bushings, that crater primer can throw that off. So like I said, make sure you're knocking out those bad primers, especially if they have craters, and try and use an anvil when possible. So there really isn't much to when it comes to seating bullets. Just make sure you're reading those directions, and especially whether you want to crimp or not. Like I said, I do not crimp my ammunition unless it's hunting ammunition. I might put a light kiss of a crimp on it, or if it's the fan type of ammunition, I might put a heavy crimp on it, something I'm literally going to be burying into the ground type thing. Other than that, when it comes to my precision ammunition, I do not crimp my ammo as long as I have good neck tension. Just make sure you're reading those directions on your dies. Obviously your presses, each press is going to be different. Get those directions, read them once, and then read them once again. You know, if I was to give you some words of advice, you know, probably the most stressful part when you're first reloading is full length resizing and trying to get a consistent headspace bump. At least for me, that's what was the case. I always found that to be quite difficult. And it's something that you just have to learn on your own reloading journey. And each press is different. At least this Forster coax press, when it comes to full length resizing, getting a consistent headspace bump, it doesn't like to be overcammed. I'm running this consistently, and as this part of the press touches the linkages, I stop. I don't push down on that. I don't overcam it. But on the other hand, when it comes to my Hornady lock and load press, at least when I used to full length resize on that, it likes to be overcammed. When I say overcammed, I'm kind of overcamming the linkages. I feel somewhat of a hump. It comes over the hump, and at the bottom of the hump, I stop. I don't push down on that when it overcams. If you're not sure what I'm talking about in regards to overcamming, that may be something to do more research on. But at least for me, when I was starting out, that was the most frustrating part of trying to learn how to reload. Other than that, that's it. We're done, and this ammunition's ready for the range. And I hope you're taking this knowledge and passing it on to the next generation. You know, when you go to the voting booth and you're trying to protect these rights, especially with the Second Amendment, your vote can always get canceled, especially within 2 to 4 years. But there's something that they cannot take away from you, and that is your knowledge. And I'm hoping that you are transferring this knowledge onto the next generation. That is how you're truly going to protect your rights. Well, that's the end of this start to finish reloading series. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, make sure you subscribe, like, and share. Check out the description box below for www.epintegrations.com for our products of the EP 2.0 annealer and the EP lockdown reloading blocks. And I will see you guys in the next EP Integrations video.